Hello, folks. My name's DC Rockwell, and this is your co-host, Elio Grieco. Welcome to Code and Chaos, a pseudo-random conversation that starts with tech and ends where it ends, about an hour or two later. Elio, tonight we are talking about documentation and knowledge sharing, aren't we?
Yeah, I was thinking about, so I had a few people mention our last episode, which I think was awesome. There's good stuff with almost said the name of our next guest, with Alexander Blanc, was excellent. But I started out saying I'm not a big fan of LinkedIn, and people like, dude, you're trying to promote stuff on LinkedIn. Why are you bashing LinkedIn? And so part of that we'll have to get into in another episode is, and I guess we'll touch on it a little bit now, LinkedIn is so close to being really good. It's not. It's so close, though. There's a few key little changes that would take it from what it is now, which is kind of okay, and you can find some interesting people, but there's some frustrations that are small but significant, and you could take it into something that was really, really awesome. And most of those are around not being able to organize data. You can't really meaningfully search. You could search names, but you can't search what you've done on LinkedIn. You can't search what other people have done. You can't, like, if you show what is all my activity, you could show all of your activity, but you can't show just the stuff where you replied to people. You could show the posts, you could show other stuff, but you can't like weed out all the noise from all the little clicking like and all this. And so these are seemingly small things, but they have a huge impact on how useful it is. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today.
So this ties into LinkedIn. Are you sure you're not going to be getting messages later where they're like, you should have just stopped at, I think LinkedIn has some problems, and you want to really elaborate on all of those?
Well, I'm hoping that, and this is probably foolish because I used to submit things to Apple. They have a little form that goes straight to dev null, and you can submit stuff and be like, hey, this is broken, or hey, this could be way better, And I did that like a dozen times way back when Apple, before they got all obsessed with money like they are now. When they were doing really good computer science. People forget that back in 2003, Apple had some of the best supercomputers per dollar by a wide margin. Like NEC Earth Simulator was 3 times faster, but the Virginia Tech cluster, the X cluster there of X serves, was like a tenth the price. So the numbers were in their favor. So anyway, Apple gave up on that. And I don't know, that was my first kind of major disappointment with giving feedback and putting all this work into like filing reports for them and being like, hey, here's the thing, it'll make you a lot more valuable, please do it. And then of course nothing happens. So I have hope because I know a handful of people that worked at LinkedIn, I think are still there. One of them gave a tour. We were actually out there at the beginning of the year, right before the pandemic went nuts. And we got a tour, and some of the younger guys that we sponsored to go out to the Stanford Blockchain Conference, one of the days, because Stanford Blockchain Conference, absolutely amazing. It is the only blockchain conference that I really want to go to because it's hardcore academic, like just, looking at, does this mathematically work? I still think one of my favorite things there is Max Fang's paper on why Bitcoin and all these things will always re-centralize. So just really good stuff there. So it's just too much, though. It should only be 2 days. Like as much as I love sinking my teeth into intellectual stuff, 3 days is too much. So we went to LinkedIn and we got to tour, and they have a really cool campus. Just cafeteria is insane. Like just all these different, it's literally like if you've gone to a high-end Vegas buffet back in the heyday when there's like 2 dozen sections, each with their own theme. Like there's an Italian, there's a Japanese section, there's a Mexican section, and you can get an entire meal just in that section. Like that's kind of how LinkedIn is. Like it's really phenomenal. The pizza there was like full wood burning oven and everything. So really cool building, really great people working there. And I'm just like, maybe this will be the one time that there are suggestions. They actually like, oh yeah, let's do that. Let's become as useful as we possibly can be to our users. So I do have hope.
The only time I've ever used LinkedIn was to get a job. That's the only time. And I was actually surprised when I went on there, looked at your activity, and noticed that this is your social network. This is like what you use to actually keep in touch with people and share things. And I see there's lots of other people like Alexander Blanc, who was just on the show. He has like a lot of followers on there. It says 500 plus, but he said he has like 40,000, and it's like
something like that.
I just didn't know it could be. I didn't know there was an audience on there, and now I'm kind of, I don't know, looking at it a little different, but still, so I went on there yesterday, and I was poking around, being like, oh, so it is a social media network. Let's take a look at this, and then I started to feel some of the same feelings that I was having on Facebook and
Mm,
everything else, and I was like, you know what, this is bad for me. I'm not going to do
mm.
this.
So far, at least because I try to kind of curate my connections. I haven't gotten rid of all the old ones, but I do try to, like when I've had a few requests, not a huge number yet, but you get these obviously scammy, like, hey, and you're like, hello, you respond back, hey, and they're like, what do you do? And wait, you're on LinkedIn. And I know personally, I don't like to leak a ton of information. So I have a whole bunch of stuff missing. Like what you see on LinkedIn is like not even half of what I've actually done. If you want to know what I'm doing, like let's talk, reach out. I'll send you my CV if that warrants it. But I'm not just going to put it on there. But there is some stuff on there. You can get a decent idea if you actually spend 5 minutes digging through my activity, my posts. Like, you know what I do, right? So when someone comes on there and's like, hey, what do you do? It's like, why are you private messaging me? It's right there. I just scroll through the posts. Sorry, next. So it's not too bad though. There's not a ton of that. Although I don't have a huge number of followers or connections, so it's probably a lot worse for someone like Alexander or David Knickerbocker. Um, there's a whole bunch of people with a lot more connections that I'm talking to that I'm following their posts and exchanging messages with, and there's some really good content on there. I mean, I've been absolutely just amazed by the quality of the stuff on there, and in different areas like machine learning, data privacy, obviously cybersecurity. Since I was doing that for the last 5 years, I got kind of sucked into that field. Have a ton of connections on there, and I'm still people still think I'm a cybersecurity guy, and I'm just like, no, I'm a dev who paid attention to security. I'm not a hacker. I'm not a security guy. I'm a dev first and foremost. I want to build cool things that work all the time for me or the people I'm building them for. And so, unlike a lot of devs, I think there's not enough emphasis on if you're going to build it, it better stay under the control of the people you build it for. That's a total. In fact, there's an ongoing. Just today, this morning, had a discussion with someone who, the Boeing 737 Max 8, that had a interesting aerodynamic design. They pushed the engines forward and up so the plane, they wouldn't scrape the ground when it landed, which changed the characteristics during a stall. Like that plane, like fighter planes, when you start getting into a stall, the engines catch air and push you further into a stall. That's bad. And as one guy put it, one article when that first happened, he's like, planes that have that characteristic aerodynamically tend to have ejection seats, tend not to be, commercial jetliners. So they put in the MCAS system, and the MCAS system, you would expect it would be designed with all these redundancies so that you'd have, all these different, like most systems in a lot of these planes, they're quorum systems. There's 3 sets of sensors. There's 3 separate computers. If one thing wigs out and breaks or crashes, you don't want the plane doing the same. So there are actually 3 redundant systems. The pilots can switch over and they can manually take one out of the quorum. But for some reason, MCAS was not built on those principles. It was built taking inputs from a single sensor. And then when it got bad data and it decided the plane was, close to a stall, it would, trim up, it'd push the nose down. And so the pilots would try to override that, and they'd be fighting the MCAS system. And Boeing didn't really bother to tell them about this system. And the steps to deactivate it, to like permanently deactivate and go back to manual trimming of the plane, were like really complicated, non-obvious, and they weren't trained in that, which is why you had 2 crashes. And so there's this argument between like, was that software properly designed? And I'm like, absolutely not. Like that's no, all the software and the hardware on a plane should be designed to keep the thing flying and the people alive. And if you didn't take the normal steps to make sure there's the right redundancies and right, fail-safe conditions, that when it does fail, it fails safe and doesn't nose you into the ground at 500 miles an hour. Like, to me, that's the worst kind of software error. That's a misspecification error. You wrote the wrong software. That's the worst. You can't fix that any other way other than by totally replacing the software. And this other individual's like going back and forth with me, like, well, no, the software's fine. We just got it. And it's like, anyway, so there's some of that. There's some interesting opinions on there, but for the most part, I find it to be pre-Stampede Facebook. where way back in the day, Facebook, you could actually have some half decent discussions and they wouldn't spiral into extremism like within 2 comments. Like it was actually mostly people you knew, and you could actually talk about something and actually maybe everyone examine a thing from multiple sides and not, come away wanting to strangle each other. So we'll see. We'll see if that stays that way. But I do notice there's a little bit of a transfer from Facebook of people coming to LinkedIn, and some people are really annoyed. They're like, "Oh, that's not LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a professional network. Why are you posting non-professional stuff?" And there are more and more things that are not. I won't say there's not much not safe for work stuff, but there's stuff that's like, yeah, it's not really. That's funny. It's entertaining, but it doesn't have anything to do with professional business. And I don't mind that stuff as long as as long as it's less than half of the stuff on there. I think it's fine. You got to have a little levity. You don't want to be just, totally monotone and stick in the mud all the time. Even in a professional work environment, that's not a great culture to have.
Oh, plus you don't want to be the social network police who tells other people what they can post on their accounts, right? You can always just mute them, right?
Yeah.
Unsubscribe, unfollowed. Sorry. So what does any of this have to? What does any of this have to do with documentation?
Well, like I said, I don't mean documentation, to be clear. I mean documents. Subtle distinction. I mean, documentation is documents, but I mean just the ability to take information, and all of these platforms, be it Google, LinkedIn, Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok. I'm not going to name them all. There's too many. They keep multiplying. But a lot of these things, there's been an ongoing debate that I think the public has kind of just given up on about, do you go chronological timeline or do you go algorithmic? And almost everything is algorithmic, and the algorithms are opaque, and it just uses whatever algorithm to put stuff in your face that it thinks is going to, keep you on the platform, keep you engaged. Whereas most people just want to see a chronological timeline. I just want to see, since the last time I was on here, all the people I know and care about, and I'm interested in what they have to say. What did they do? What did they say?
Well, I think that's contextual. Like, I agree with you if we were, say, looking up what did my friends post? What did people I know post? I would want to know what's the most recent things that my friends post. But if you're on Reddit, very infrequently are you going to sort it by new.
Well, that's true.
You're usually going to be sorting it by best. And best is the stuff that was voted up the most. But I guess that's the difference, isn't it? Is that there's a ranking system in Reddit that's not really present in the... Well, I guess it's kind of present, but at least Reddit allows you to downvote. And that's the big thing, right? Yeah. And that allows...
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's where you start to get more relevant content, because if it sucks, it doesn't matter how many people upvoted it. There's going to be a lot more people who downvote it, and then it's going to fall to the bottom instead of float to the top.
Yeah, and you tend that is one thing that Facebook, to a lesser extent, Facebook, although they've resisted putting in a dislike button for. Do they have one now? I don't know. I haven't been on there in years.
They do not.
Because it's bad for their platform to let people dislike things, even though.
Hold on a minute. You're saying. It's probably their stated reason is that it's bad for the users. People don't want to see that, and it's like, oh, I'm so glad that you've grown some care for your users, their emotional state, Facebook. But so there's a ranking systems, but I mean, are we really talking about just knowledge transfer? And we're talking about, you have some knowledge, you want to send that out to people, or are we talking about like status updates? Or are we talking about both?
Yeah, let's come back to that. I want to make one final point on the dislike. Like, so you don't see that. And you even, besides not having really a dislike thing on LinkedIn, no way to show that I don't like this, because people are doing sales pitches. Quite honestly, a lot of posts are sales pitches. And I tend to follow people who want to actually talk about stuff that's not every post a sales pitch. And that I actually did find, I had seen the post Alexander mentioned last show. And I went back and I really dug through the comments, and man, there were some people in there that were just, actually a lot of people, the posts I went through, the comments, they were like, yeah, no, this is good stuff. You're right. The cloud has been in kind of a terrible failure in 2020. And by the way, Notion was down today. Slack was down. So
we felt that.
It's keep coming. So but there were some people that were just pissed, and they, without citing any resources, without links, without any kind of substantial, they're like, this is really irresponsible, you're giving security a bad name. They're like just really lacing into Alexander, and it's like, no, he's pointing out a right.
But what did he post?
He basically just said 2020 has been a banner year for failures of the cloud. And there was a little bit more to it. And then at the bottom, he had just a few little conversation starters of like, how do we get out of this? And stuff that we got into more on the last episode.
Right.
But people were just pissed that he was not towing the party line of the cloud is amazing. Everything should be in the cloud. All these cloud businesses like sell.
How does that even make sense? Like who are the people who are upset about it? Is it that, I mean, Alexander did make the point that, for the average person, putting their stuff in the cloud, as long as they're not putting the stuff in the cloud that is going to be, super sensitive, that as long as you can configure it properly, as long as you have the expertise to lock it down and not do stupid things with it, that they do actually, you can actually get some more safety by default. But
the one that really got my attention, because I'm like, that is absolutely false, and I can't say too much. So I'll speak in generalities, but this one person is like, oh, the cloud is great, and it has IAM, identity and access management, for those that don't speak the cloud lingo, but it has IAM, and they can't access your data. And I'm like, I'm reading this comment, and I'm like, this is absurd. Does this guy actually believe this? Because if he does, that's terrifying. First of all, if you have a system you build, someone's got to be the admin. Someone's got to have the keys to the database, to the servers. Whoever that is has access to the whole thing, directly or indirectly. And in many cases, you'll build in a system to impersonate users, not as a malicious thing, but like I've built this into a number of websites I've built. And I've seen this at other companies that I won't name that, they're indicative of the industry. Let's just say that. But you have to have this, because when someone calls and they're like, I don't know what's going on, fix my account, you have to have a way. You don't want to be like, well, what's your password? Because if you ask them for their password to log in as them, then that encourages terrible password hygiene, and that leads to lots of security issues. So that's a no-go. So what you have to be able to do is temporarily take over another person's account to be able to troubleshoot what the heck is going on. So pretty much every system, every platform out there, there is at least some group of people, more than one, that hopefully more than one. If it's only one person, that's terrifying. But there's a group of people that can just impersonate any user and basically get to any data. And the only time that's not actually true is if people are sending data encrypted for basically cloud cold storage of encrypted data, which, you can do that for backups, but you can't really do much with encrypted data. Someday there's this cool thing called homomorphic encryption. And right now it started with an insane penalty of like 9 orders of magnitude. So you take a 1 gigahertz processor down to 1 hertz, which is super painful. But right now, last I heard, it's down to like 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. 3 is really the last one I can confirm. So that means it's 1,000 times more expensive. So with homomorphic encryption, I can encrypt some data. I can send it to a cloud provider to modify, to process while it's encrypted, but 1,000 times slower. And then they can send it back. And it's like, well, okay, well, that's cool. But the whole point is the cloud's supposed to be cheaper. And if it's 1,000 times more expensive, because there's a 3 order magnitude computational hit on working with homomorphic encrypted data, it's not cheaper anymore. Why would I just keep my sensitive data on-prem and I don't have to worry about it? So there are some theoretical computer science workarounds, but they're not out there yet. They're a ways off. They have some issues, and it's just insane seeing people try to take someone to task when they're so far off the mark. Anyway,
are you really surprised by that? Like, let's be real. Come on. People argue all the time about crap they have no idea about.
I want to be surprised. It's like the Mulder. I want to believe. I want to be surprised by stupidity. No, I want to be surprised by overconfidence. But yeah, I'm not. I've met people who, will tell you, I guess the term generally is called mansplaining, but there's a lot of people that will splain to you no matter who you are, no matter who they are, that will confidently tell you stuff that you're like, absolutely not. Like, I know this, I just talked to an expert, or I am an expert in this field, and what you're saying is complete garbage. It's
Well, that's
totally untrue.
Texas came up with a response to that I like.
What's that?
Bless your heart.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah,
The
so,
blasted,
yeah, these days somebody's just like, you do know that quantum computers are going to completely decrypt everything instantaneously. Sorry, Sean.
going to decrypt the universe.
What can you say? Bless
to the
your
singularity.
heart.
Yeah. But this is a perfect segue into back to the main topic of what's up, Docs. Why?
Hold on. I do want to apologize, Sean. I know that's not entirely your position, and last time we had this conversation. So my buddy Sean and I, we had this conversation all about quantum computers and encryption. And here's an example of me talking about crap I don't know. Okay, so I don't really understand quantum computing. I don't even really understand, like how that affects cryptography. I have a pretty rudimentary understanding of cryptography at all. Just through having known you for 15 years, I've picked up a few things, We've done many episodes on cryptography. But when I meet an actual cryptographer, it's a little different. I don't speak exactly the same language as you guys. And so I don't really have the expertise to talk smack on Sean, because he and I are in the same boat, I think, which is we're both armchair cryptographers, armchair quantum, physicists who, we like talking about this stuff. And it's interesting to talk about this stuff. It's just that we don't have the experience of actually hands-on working with these kinds of things. So, Sean, my bad. I'm a jerk, and I shouldn't have called you out like that, because, like, honestly, anyone could call me out for the same thing. So, anyway, it's a little different for this guy.
Well, I'm not a cryptographer. I just play one on here. But no, I'm getting to work with a PhD cryptographer who has a just voluminous publishing, all these papers, pages and pages of papers. And a mathematician friend of mine, again, PhD in mathematics. I like math. I don't love math. I'm not in love with math. But I know people who are. I know people who are amazing with it. So I'm just like, when I have questions, it's like, hey, what about this? And I get to borrow their brain for a little bit, which is awesome. And so, yeah, it's kind of humbling to be able to talk to those people. But he was like, oh my God, he's like, her papers are absolutely incredible. And I'm like, well, good, because you're going to get to work with her, hopefully. So, yeah, good. And I had to explain some interesting ideas for this grant that we're working on. And I had this moment, imposter syndrome, where I'm like, well, what I'm about to say either is going to go over reasonably well, and hopefully, or I will be laughed off the phone call, just like some of these comments. And she'll be like, that's cute, but you have no idea what you're talking about. Why are we doing a grant with this moron? So luckily it was the first option. I was not laughed off the call. And she's like, oh, that is interesting. That actually is reminiscent of these papers. I'm like, oh, thank God, because I haven't read those papers. So got lucky on that one.
So when you nod your head and you're just like, yes, those papers. What are those papers again? I lost my link.
I try not to do that. I try not to pretend I know more than I try to just come clean and be like, I've told a number of experts, I'm like, look, that's all I know. Like, we're at the end of my knowledge, so you got to take it from here, because I got 10 minutes worth on that. We talked for 10 minutes. I'm done. I got nothing left.
When I was younger, I got caught in those kinds of lies way too often. And I've learned my lessons through just sheer embarrassment. I've learned my lesson. Do not pass yourself off as being an expert in something that you're not. Well, I actually remember I did a job interview one time, and I was in my early 20s, and I had wrote down on my resume, it was like every single thing on the resume said expert next to it. Every single one. And the guy sat me down. He goes, so it says that you're an expert in everything, huh? And I was just like, I was like, whoa. I was like, and so he started asking me questions, and I kept up pretty well. But then he started asking me some more serious questions, and I was just like, oh, dude. I was like, listen. I was like, and some of the and the thing was, is the questions he was asking me were not relevant to the job. It was just that he really wanted to teach me a lesson, and he did, and he ended up hiring me anyway. But he taught me the lesson: don't make a resume where you claim to be an expert in something unless you could truly actually teach a class with other experts in that class who are going to all be nodding along with you as you go.
There is, speaking of experts, there is a sketch. We should try to throw the link in the description. I don't think we could show it on here, but people should definitely watch this. It's called The Expert, and there's like 4 sketches at this point. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Loris, I'm going to butcher this. Loris Beinertz, Beinerts. I don't know how to say that, but brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It is anyone who's been in the business world and dealt with people who, I don't even give too much away. It's hilarious. If you've been in the situation and you're the technical person in the room and people start asking you for stuff that's just, you're like, that can't happen. This is like the woman who, she wanted to do good stuff, but 3 hours going over, she's like, well, I want to do keyless encryption. And I'm like, that's not a thing. There's always a key. There's ways of deriving a key. You're probably talking about key derivation, but like ROT 13, where you just rotate by 13 places around the alphabet, which is basically just obfuscation. I wouldn't even consider encryption. Like, that's keyless encryption. But that's trivial and useless and just kind of fun. It's not real encryption. And anyway, so it's stuff like that. And I was gently trying to nudge her toward some books that I'm like, you should read these. They will give you a baseline understanding of cryptography. They've been helpful to me. And then we can, then we can actually start talking about what you can really do to help improve medical records dramatically. And that happened twice. And the second time, luckily, I wasn't the only person she had sought out for advice. There was another guy who was there. And so he was like, no, he's backing me up for like, what a saint, for like 3 hours. And she's like, oh, I'm going to do this on Google Cloud. They're going to make everything secure. And we're like, that's not how it works. They secure their infrastructure, but your stuff is just, you're on your own. And she's like, no, they secure everything. And luckily he's like, no, I just did a survey for our company for 5 cloud providers, including Google Cloud. And he's like, they don't. Like, I just did this for 3 months. So it was good to have some backup and I didn't want her to feel like I'm just, I'm literally trying to help you with your idea and give you free advice that could help you make tons of money if you do it right. But I can't bend the laws of physics to make that happen. So anyway, The Expert is awesome.
Yeah. So let's get back to docs or documents, right? So, I mean, we're talking about having lots of documents and sharing them. I mean, what about docs are we, what's up docs, dude?
Yeah, let's take a step all the way back. There's 4 key things that computers, I think everyone expects computers, really needs computers to do. You want computers to be able to collect information, whether you want to say write down, store, I guess is the best term, to store information, to organize information, to send information, and to retrieve information. Like, for most people, like, computation's great. Crud. And there are scientists and gamers and whatnot that want to do like insane amounts of computation, but that's not most people. Most people, computation is just a means to accomplish these other 4: store, organize, send, and retrieve, right? That's what most people want to do. That's email, that's Facebook, that's LinkedIn, that's a whole bunch of stuff.
I like CRUD better because it sounds better. Create, read, update, and delete.
Yeah, for the more technically minded. So that's the stuff we want to be able to do. And I think, ironically, computers are terrible at pretty much all of those things. And so documents are one way to achieve that. And I actually gave a talk that, unfortunately, there was some issues that the second Decentralized Web Summit, all of the decentralized web stuff out of the Internet Archive that Wendy Hanamura put together, phenomenal. Absolutely. I hope they're able to keep going. They're kind of doing some online virtual stuff, but man, like, just incredible. The people that are there, the team that they have putting that together, excellent stuff. A lot of the videos are up, so if you didn't get to go to the first 3 of these, go watch the videos. Unfortunately, one video that's not up because they had some issues with the company they hired to do the filming. It looks like they got all the big talks, which is awesome because there were some really good talks in the second DWeb Summit. But the lightning talks, I found my talk, and it was me talking with my hands, Italian style, because I'm half Italian, and just, gesticulating for 5 minutes. But the audio was someone else, and it's like, oh, good. Like the one piece that was useful. I wish the audio was what I had, because the audio was good. I gave a talk called "Curation is the Cure," and it was about how do we organize knowledge and how do we move away from these opaque algorithms that we're using. That, like we talked about, everything's in a stream, everything's via search. And it's increasingly being like what gets shown to you is increasingly being decided by advertisers or other people who do not have your interest. You don't get to decide what you see first. You see what you're shown. And that's, to me, really kind of sad and disgusting. Computers are really, really good. Look at the data science stuff happening right now. We can organize and make sense of just piles of information that if we had to do it physically would take a team of thousands of people or more, and libraries the size, well, much bigger than football fields, the size of small cities, to store that stuff on paper. And computers can be used to do amazing stuff and pull interesting meaning out of insane amounts of data. But right now they're not. Like, everyone's using these cloud services that I find a lot of their interfaces, just finding a specific piece of data, even in something like Google Docs, I find not nearly as intuitive as just the old file system on your computer. You put it there, you know where it is, and it's stable. You know where it is, and you can find it 3 or 4 different ways. Yeah.
Well, not as intuitive as
hierarchical file system.
So you think the hierarchy is it's just taxonomy?
No,
that's
how, I don't know.
Taxonomy
has limitations. So you run into limitations of a taxonomy pretty quick. You can kind of get around them by having multiple taxonomies, what they call multifaceted search, where you have one taxonomy that's like the species, one taxonomy that's like the if you're classifying animals, for instance, you can do
mammals.
Genetic, you can do you can do morphic, like what is the form of the body, you can do color based, all geographic, etc. But yeah, you can't fit everything. A taxonomy collapses it down into one way of looking at the world that organizes it a specific way and bakes in those assumptions. And if you're accessing it that way, like a genetic taxonomy, if you're trying to see how things are genetically related, that's great. But sometimes you don't actually care whether things are, like if you're looking at convergent evolution, like where did flight evolve separately? Like genetic doesn't really help. I mean, maybe someday we'll be sophisticated enough to dig that out of the genes, but the genetic taxonomy is not going to be helpful in that case.
So in my career, I had to categorize, classify music for the music industry.
Yeah.
And this turned out to be a very difficult thing to do. And I went around looking for, some guidance on, has anybody tried, creating an actual taxonomy for music before, some way of classifying a song and making it searchable. And it led me to this Sony white paper, which I have not been able to find since I originally got it. I've been trying to find it. If anybody knows where it is, let me know. Send me a link. But it's all on the taxonomy of music and the classification of songs. And it is a multi-dimensional taxonomy. So you have, for example, maybe you have what decade or what year did these songs come out, the time, the date that it was published, right? And you can look at all of these along a 2-dimensional line, basically. Then you also have, for example, what instruments were in the song. Then you also have what's the genre of the song. Then you also have what were the inspiring genres of that song. You also have, for example, connections between these different taxonomies. And so what you have, for example, is this particular decade has associated to it some particular genres, right?
Okay.
This genre has associated to it some very famous acts. Those famous acts have associated with it very famous musicians and certain instruments. Then there's certain keys. There are certain moods of the music which are associated with, like, for example, there's a very distinct mood to Pink Floyd's music, and there's there's all these different layers of information, this metadata, which you have to combine together in a three-dimensional neural network, a type B neural network, in order to make it useful. And so you have a type B neural network is where all the nodes have a particular strength in between them. And so you have, for example, the 60s might be more strongly attached to rock than the 80s, right?
Okay.
But they're both attached to it, right?
Yeah.
And so this is, and then you have to write some software that can go through this massive data set in order, which is basically a graph, and you have to go through that to find all the songs.
Is this really a taxonomy or an ontology?
Well, I'm not sure if I know the difference.
So from a discussion I had, I actually met a woman who did data classification quite a few years ago, and we had a little discussion, and she's like, "Oh, well, what you really want is an ontology, which is more of just a graph, whereas a taxonomy tends to imply a tree, which is a type of graph, but it's constrained, whereas an ontology is just a way of just linking any number of just a free-form kind of graph."
No, the taxonomy is just it's a classifying system. And that's what, and it can be a hierarchical. How do you say that? It can use a hierarchy, right? That's one type of a taxonomy. But there's other kinds of taxonomies, like, for example, technology uses something that looks a lot like a hierarchy, but you'll see jumps between them. So, for example, the hammer evolved along a particular line, and you see that there's the early hammer, and then you have the better hammer than that, then you have the claw hammer, for example. But then on another one you have
double claw hammer, PHP.
and they both diverged from the handheld tool, which has this handle and a head on it, right? But then you have the axe on another line, right? But then at some point, as they're going down like this, and they're diverging from each other, and the axes are getting better, the hammers are getting better, somebody came up with, well, what if I just combine a hammer and an axe? And we'll have the hacks, or the hammer. I'm not sure what you would call it, but the point is that it can do jumps across branches, and we can't necessarily do that. We can kind of with genetics today with biology. Like, you can make a cat glow in the dark by giving it specific genes from another species. Well, but the point is that taxonomy, I just looked it up, and it just says the classification of something, a system of classification.
Again, I'm not an expert in that area, but that was what she was explaining to me. But yeah, and interesting, like what you're talking about, there is horizontal gene transfer. Viruses will carry bits besides themselves across different species. It's just not as extreme as what we can do with genetic engineering.
Well, I do think looking at the definition of ontology, that probably an ontology is a taxonomy. It just it is a taxonomical, I think that's the word, system. But it's the second one of the definitions is a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being, and I don't think that's what we're talking about. But the second says a set of concepts and categories in a subject area or domain that shows their properties and the relations between them. And I think that does actually better describe the music system that I was talking about.
Okay.
I'd call it a music ontology, sure. Why not? But the point is that it's a system that has multiple types of classifications and then relationships between those classifications and each other. And you can think of it as each layer is like a two-dimensional layer with its own relationships between the different nodes on there. So you have, like, for example, you'll have drums, which will be associated with guitars, which will be associated with, microphones or something like that, right? But then all three of those would be three-dimensionally linked to the next layer up, which would be genres, and you'd have rock that would be associated with all three of those, right?
Yeah.
And so it turns into this three-dimensional classification system where you can go across between instruments. So each of the instruments can be associated with each other, and all of the genres can be associated with each other on their various on their respective two-dimensional layers, if you will. But you can also get links in between them three-dimensionally. And that's how, we basically tried to solve the problem of coming up with a competitive next generation music search system, which we never got to finish. Because I never got to finish it, and I probably am not going to, I'll let you know our awesome name for it. We called it the Decibellum system.
Nice.
So it's for decibel and cerebellum. And we thought that was cool because it was a type B neural network, which searched through the music industry's major, metadata. But that's the most sophisticated system I've seen so far. And I'm not saying our particular system, but it's actually based entirely on the Sony white paper, by the way. So it's not even our idea. It was Sony that came up with the idea. We just did an implementation of that idea. But that is the most sophisticated ontology that I've ever seen actually proposed. And so I don't even know of anything that would be more complicated than that kind of system where there's layers, there's links between the layers and links between the nodes on the layer and links between the layers themselves.
I'm of course thinking of David Knickerbocker, who does data science and machine learning. We should have him on and ask about this because I feel like he could probably add a heck of a lot to this discussion. But I want to focus on one thing. So you're talking about all these links. And right now we tend to think like, okay, we'll have some ML make the links. But right now there is no ML algorithm that's anywhere near as good as a human brain. And so my whole talk was, can we build an internet that can self-curate? And I think yes, and I'll go into details in a second, but it looked like you had a point.
Yeah, I was going to say part of the Decibellum system was that it was going to link up into Amazon Turk and allow humans to actually do the classification. They would listen to a song, and then they would start classifying it by decade. They would do a Google search and find out, what decade does this belong to. We would get 3 people per song to actually do it, and then we would error correct between them, and then and then they would list all the different instruments in it, and whichever instruments actually showed up in all 3 of them would be used. And so we actually did. We thought of the same thing, but of course, machine learning wasn't very big back then.
Yeah.
But even today, I would say that it would probably not get us very far. Like, you could probably classify instruments, but you would have to give it a lot of training data in order to do that. So it could probably do that. It could probably classify the key, but I don't know how it's going to classify, for example. Well, I mean, I guess you could automate looking up the data for the decade and the artists. But the mood, I guess, that would be hard. What is this thing cheerful? Is it exciting? Is it angry sounding? Things like that. I would imagine that would be a lot more difficult to do, because where are you going to find a training set of music that's already classified for that?
Well, and some of that too. I mean, you can pull patterns out, but some of this stuff is subjective. So I don't know, like having a machine do subjective work, like there's some really interesting questions of what does that even mean? So I think that's an amazing idea. And there was quite a bit of research that I was following very intently about a decade plus ago that now, this bothers me so much. Now Web 3.0 is like, oh, the web based on blockchain. It's like, oh, yeah, it's not going to work. Blockchain is not a general purpose construct. It has major problems, major downsides. At some point this
You
year,
really want to get ahead of yourself on this one? Isn't that what we're
yeah,
talking about this
I'm
weekend?
gonna no, actually, we're talking about threat models and just that part, because going over all the problems with blockchain would take many hours. We're gonna do a big comprehensive article on that later in the year, but it's taking a lot of research because there's so many problems with it. So anyway, like, it bothers me that we've just turned Web 3.0 into this stupid blockchain trendy idea. What Web 3.0 used to mean, which was way more interesting, was the semantic web. And you had RDF, you had Sparkle, you had OWL. I can only expand one of those acronyms. OWL was the ontological web language. And I think RDF might have been like relational data formats or something. I don't remember what Sparkle stands for. But you had
in a way, are you is this conversation really about the semantic web, like that same thing we've been talking about for the past 20 years, which
partly.
is I would like to know what this thing is on my screen. I want to know that it is an address. I want to know that this thing is associated with this recipe card. I want to, for example, what did we call those? There was a tagging system, and I think that's what you're talking about. Is that
that was an old one that was popular for some of that. That was pre-computer, and that's getting popular again. There's a number of there's Zettler and a number of other Zettelkasten programs. There's actually a Zettler library for doing Zettelkasten stuff in Rust that I have yet to really fully explore. But that's a way of linking ideas together. But yeah, so this idea goes way back. And since we're all outsourcing our brains to digital devices anyway, I think they should work well. And we covered some of the security stuff on how they should work well. And we'll cover that a lot more. But that's only part of it. The other part is they need to work well. Like, when I need to go find data, I would like my device, I'd like it to be under my control. I don't want to be at the whim of some other organization that can just pull access. There was a thing today, a headline about a guy who's like, I spent $57 million on Facebook ads and they just kicked me off the platform. Like, that's pretty insane. If you have that kind of spend, almost 60 million, and they can just boot you. I mean, I kind of hope he did something really awful to make it like, kind of like, oh, okay, that makes sense why they kicked him off. Because if he didn't do anything awful, that's pretty messed up to put in that kind of money and just get cast aside at the whims of a large, FANG corp. So I would like computers to be able to help me think better and find that. What was that thing I was talking about? Or what was that study? And I'm building some of my own tools, but they're really immature. They're really incomplete. I got a ways to go. Like on LinkedIn, I will manually post that I care about, that I know. I wish it did this for all of them, but the ones I know I want to find later, I actually have a set of little scripts set up where I can copy out pretty easily the text of the post and any other related comments, a link back to find it, and then I can put that into a markdown file, and the link to go retrieve it again is in the front matter. And then I can just do a full text search on my machine, and I still have all the text anyway. And then if it's still up, I can click through and go find it again on LinkedIn. But that's like, why do I have to do all this extra work? It's a computer. That should be automatic. And I would love it if we could pull all this stuff together. And the point I really want to get in before we run out of time, or make sure we get in, is in the early days of the internet, there was we're talking 20 plus years ago, you had Alta Vista, and I'm trying to remember, oh man, I cannot even remember a name of one of the directories, but there was this dichotomy between search engines, which gave you lots of results but low quality, and directories, which gave you a handful of results but high quality. And we still have that today, except now it's search engines have dominated, and you have Google, and you have, DuckDuckGo, and you have some clustering engines, and yeah, I guess you get Bing too. But no one really talks about that much. And so you have all these search engines that have fluid algorithms that are ever changing. You're never sure exactly what's going to pop up. It's usually pretty kind of good, but finding an article that you found previously is hit or miss. And now curated knowledge has moved on to GitHub, and GitHub awesome repos, and kind of on Reddit, and kind of on Stack Overflow, and to a lesser extent LinkedIn. But the reason initially we moved away from curated is if you tried to have a company that was going to index the entire web, the only way to do that, the only way to even attempt that, and you're still not going to get everything. You're not going to get the deep web stuff you got to be logged into, or the dark web, which is different protocols. The only way to do that is automated. But what I talked about at DWeb, if we built a system where every person could organize their little, because everyone does have some way of organizing their data on the computer. Everyone has a way of organizing their bookmarks, putting them into files, doing something so they can find the data again. A lot of the ways are not optimal. They're kind of slow and painful, but everyone's got something. If you had a system that was easy enough to use and powerful enough where normal people could, curate their little section of the web, and you could carefully share the portions of that you're willing to share with the people you're willing to share that with, then we could actually have a web that was self-curating. And every single bit of the web would be curated within kind of a local, but before a knowledge horizon, within each individual's knowledge horizon. Like I could see my curated data, I could see some of your curated data, some of my other friends' curated data, some of my other friends of friends' curated data, out to a certain number of levels. And I'd only see that little bit, but that's the bit that probably matters the most to me. That's what I'm going to, if I'm, in the past, prior to COVID, if I want to find a restaurant, I don't really care what Google says about the reviews. There's certain people I trust that I'm like, oh, these people know the area, they know good food. I want to know what they have to think first and foremost. And then if they don't have any opinion for this area and this type of food, then I'll go ask other people, or I'll go eventually ask Google. But that's the least optimal thing. That's the least effective thing.
So a couple of thoughts there.
Sure.
First is wouldn't a lot of things be great in this world if we could just get everybody to do something? Anything,
I don't think you have to get them. I think it's happening anyway.
No, I mean, that's not the deal. It doesn't matter if it's happening anyway. Everybody tends to organize their stuff the way they want to organize it.
Sure.
And so you just look at how people organize their houses and you can see,
true.
Some people put their silverware in a particular spot in the kitchen. And then other people do it completely wrong, completely wrong. I would argue,
you have the same issue with the search engines, though. No one complains that the way the search engines are organizing the results probably doesn't match with hardly anyone. And people are fine with that, with not having it organized the way it would be best for them. So why would it be that much worse if you had data being collected from a whole bunch of people that use slightly different organizational methods? And people do, if you look at hashtags, people do kind of coalesce toward a meaning over time.
So hold on. You just complained about having to go into like markup and the markups in all these different forms, and you have to go in there and find the title of the thing and whatnot. And yet you're now proposing that everybody organizes their stuff however they want. You can't have it both ways.
No.
And so hold on.
Okay, go ahead.
There's first off, I think we can split this out into two main themes of problem.
Okay.
So first is the semantic nature, making data semantic. This was attempted to be solved, like I said, about 20 years ago. We had this movement called the semantic web. And the semantic web was, basically all of the data on the web at that time was just basic HTML tags. And you didn't really know that something was a title of something, or you just had a bunch of headers, and you had to imply that maybe this person, set up their code this way, maybe this other person set up their code this way. This is a thing called microformats, which was this was trying to be the answer to that at one time, and they had these different kinds of things called cards. And these cards were, and I guess they're just called vocabularies. But anyway, they're specific formats of HTML, which this one would be for an address. This one would be for a business card. This one would be an entry of some data entry, geo, item, product, recipe, resume. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And what it does is it gives it. If I click on resume, you can see that you will see within it. These are different classes that you can add on to the sub elements inside of it. So you can put whatever, tags you want in there, but you're going to give these tags a particular class for it to have a summary, contact, education experience, stuff like that, right? So you have this spec that has been around for nearly 20 years, probably. I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but it's been around for a very, very long time. I know because, prior to the company you and I worked for, I was using this for about at least 5-6 years before that. And so this was an attempt to make the web semantic, and the semantic web was something that I believed, and I think a lot of people believed, was just going to be a thing today. And yet it's not. It's not a thing yet.
It disappeared. Yeah. And now the Web 3.0 is friggin' blockchain. But
nobody really cares about the semantic web right now.
there were, so the things I was watching, there was a really cool one called PowerSet. And PowerSet, I think, so RDF, Sparkle, Owl, obviously were protocols, and they're not dead. I believe that Solid, Tim Berners-Lee's project, is still playing with at least RDF. But I need to look into that. There's actually someone I met on the team that we'll see if we can pull them on here to talk about what they're doing, because it's really interesting. But there were PowerSet was incredible. PowerSet was almost like Freebase, which was like a database version of Wikipedia, which I think might still exist. And PowerSet had this ontological tuple browser where you could say, and I think this is the best way to do it, because some of these formats get overly complex. And if you just have 3 tuples that have content identifier, whoops, can't see the other hand, content identifier, and then relation in the middle, and you let the relation be a free form word or phrase, then just as hashtags they coalesce, they can converge on a value over time. Like someone uses one, and if it gets popular enough, it starts to mean a certain thing.
Because you can have some people that do ADDR. Some people are going to do address. Some people are going to do addresses. Some people are going to do address one. I'm just saying, those relationships won't work.
There are ways to deal with that. There are
ways, but you're back to a new problem. You're creating a new problem by doing that.
Well, I mean, right now we have no structured data, so it's even a worse problem. So
anyway, let's just agree,
ways around that,
because there's a second point to this.
Okay.
So the first is just the structure of the data. You need the data to be structured in some way so you know what it is. Then you need to know where is it, right? Your problem is that you have a problem with discoverability. You have a problem with, hey, I remember seeing this article. Damn, how do I rediscover that thing? How do I find out where that thing is? Search engines are supposed to be a form of discovery. Tag clouds are another form of discovery. Tables of content, another form of discovery. There's many different types of ways for you to discover new content or rediscover the content that you remember finding. Bookmarks are another form of discovery. So data discovery I think this is the primary problem that we're talking about. And I know we're about out of time here. We have about 1 minute left, but I believe let's save this for another show. But we bounce around between these two problems. One is the structure of the data and whether or not it is readable in a way where we can understand what it is. And then the second is that we might find it, but how do we re-find it? And I think that there's a third issue, which is the storage of that data. Where do we put it so it doesn't disappear? Where do we put it so this way, for example, that Sony white paper, what if all the copies of that online are gone now? What if they scrubbed it because it turned out that was pretty useful paper, and why don't we just keep that to ourselves? I want a copy of that dang paper. And the problem is that it was a PDF. It's not really searchable in the same ways that other file formats are. And it's not going to be easy for me to find it based on just keywords in it, because I've tried that. And so, and Google doesn't seem to be doing a good job with a search engine. So I don't really have many options for that. And I bet you have a lot of things from your past that you'd like to rediscover that don't exist anymore online because they're gone.
That's why I have actually started. I will give, even though I have no affiliation, I will give a shout out to, there is a plugin. I believe it's a web extension. I think it should work on Chrome and Firefox and anything that supports web extensions. There is one called Web Scrapbook. And it is one of the easiest / best options for archiving websites that I've found. Used to be able to just wget a page or a whole site. And now that everything is React and JavaScript, that is not really feasible anymore. JavaScript needs to run in the browser and actually give you the page before there's anything to actually archive. So wget will give you just a, basically a blank page, which is, I think, why LinkedIn, they had our latest article, The Way Forward, in the final part in our 3-part series, it put it as a 1-minute read. And I'm like, this is not a 1-minute read. This is a rather lengthy article. And I think it's because LinkedIn probably just grabbed the first bit off the blog. And it's like, oh, there's barely any text here. It'll take 1 minute. So anyway, Web Scrapbook is an amazing way of archiving that data and finding it later. And yeah, data permanence is another thing. And that's where we didn't really get to, but the final thing we'll have to pick up in another episode is the reason we titled this What's Up, Docs? There was an amazing technology called OpenDoc that Apple was all in on for quite a while, almost a decade. And then they finally just kind of abandoned it. It was phenomenal, like next gen computer science back in like the 90s. And it was the idea that you have these different types of data and you want to collect them all into one container document. You might have written text. You might have data tables to go with it. If it's a paper, you might want to visualize those into different types of graphs. And it was a really revolutionary idea because the problem we have today is like when you get an email, you're off on your digital scavenger hunt and you're linking things and you're finding these clues and trying to go positionally address, which is a terrible way to find data. You're looking for, is this data still on this server at this spot on this one server? And a lot of times it isn't. And anyway, we'll talk next time about content address data. And I think we need to go beyond that. And this is why I love Git repositories, even though they're not really ergonomic for everyone yet, is the idea that you could take all the little bits of information and cram them into one little atomic unit where once I've cloned that repo, it's really easy. I have everything I need. And not only that, but then I can grab updates. I actually have a script already that I can see. I can order by what is the least recently or most recently updated Git repo that I've cloned out of like at this point 5,000 that I have cloned because disk space is cheap. So yes. Anyway, there's some really, the tools are there. The technologies have been there in some case for decades, and I'm hoping. I don't actually no, that wasn't you. That was a dinner the other night. I'm hoping that we can get some of this stuff in place because what's happening right now is Section 230, which is a whole nother discussion. If that gets repealed, Mike Masnick has done some amazing stuff on Tech Dirt. There's like 3 articles about Section 230. I think most people do not understand. If that goes away, the internet as we know it right now is over. No more platforms, which eventually is a great thing. We can move to decentralized and distributed protocols, which are better. The problem is there's nothing that's just kind of ready for everyone to jump ship from Facebook and all these other things onto these distributed platforms just yet. We need a few more years to bake everything together to make that transition not so painful. So eventually I think, yeah, we probably should ditch Section 230, but not yet, not for at least a few years. Like we need it for a little while. If that gets tossed, anyway, that's a whole nother podcast episode. That is going to be painful if they make that happen.
Absolutely. And I also want to do a little mention that you mentioned OpenDoc, and one of my favorite Steve Jobs videos of all time is Steve Jobs' insult response, in which he actually answers the question, what about OpenDoc? And he explains very well the fate of OpenDoc at Apple. So maybe we'll play that on the next episode. Anyway, everybody, that's all the time we have for today. We will be back day after tomorrow, so stay tuned. And this weekend, we do have another special guest, so definitely tune in for this weekend. All right, I guess that's it. Everyone, have a great night. Take care.